There's more to a snowmobile than its categorical classification. Just because it's listed under a certain heading in the brochure doesn't mean it can only be enjoyed by that type of rider. And what if you really are that type of rider, but you just don't want to admit it? Fortunately these days, pretty much all sleds are capable in most conditions, which means you don't have to feel obligated to ride a certain way because of the sled you're on. Last season, Polaris took a break from offering LX or dedicated luxury amenity models, but learned a lot about what buyers were after in terms of ride quality and handling. They decided the extra bump bridging and more mellow handling of their 136-inch crossover skid frame, previously found only in the switchback models, was the answer for LX customers in 2010. But for an LX, a plusher ride was definitely needed, so a standard RideFX HPG shock was spec'd on the front arm, while a Fox position-sensitive 5 shock was installed out back. Now for anyone who's not familiar with position-sensitive shocks, allow me to take a second to explain the basics of how they work and the importance of proper skid frame setup to get them to work correctly. A typical shock forces oil through a piston that's attached to the main shock shaft. The size of opening in the piston, or the valving, stays the same through the entire shock stroke. A position-sensitive shock has bypass holes in the inner shock body at specific points that allow the oil to flow around the piston and therefore lessen the dampening force. With more bypass holes at the top of the shock stroke, small, high-frequency stutter bumps are better absorbed as the piston, and consequently your suspension, is more free to move and absorb the energy. As you encounter larger bumps, the shock compresses further into its stroke where there's fewer bypass holes, thus creating an increase in damping force to avoid those dreaded spine-tingling G-outs. Now the key to having this type of shock work properly and allow it to work through all phases of damping is to have the skid frame operate at the correct ride height. If you run the skid setup too stiff or too soft, you'll be out of the optimal operation range of shock travel. Ride height is controlled by the Torsion Springs, which is where we think Polaris may have missed the mark just a bit with their LX package. The springs are simply too stiff, even at full soft, which means the skid rides too high, outside of the shock's position-sensitive range. If you're a medium to lighter LX customer, we feel it's well worth the investment to have a softer set of torsion springs installed by your dealer right away. Of course, the IQ front suspension combined with a set of RideFX HPG Pro shocks rides amazing, and in typical Polaris fashion, the whole thing handles any trail situation without a problem. As mentioned earlier, the 136-inch skid frame is included on this model because Polaris believes it has the ability to bridge bumps better than a 121, which should provide an improved ride. But that's not the only benefit to a longer skid frame. A longer track means a larger contact patch which can help calm any nervous or darty feelings a sled may or may not possess. Amenities on this sled are what you'd expect to find on a sled in this class. A high windshield, tunnel bag, reverse, and a 12-volt outlet are all present. So are a set of mirrors, which you may notice are missing from our test unit. Mirrors are a great feature and are useful for any rider in any class, but they gotta look cool. And the way Polaris had the ones mounted on the LX to the handlebars killed any cool factor that sled could ever have. So we just took them right off. The final area of this sled I'd like to talk about is the engine. The one-up touring class is quickly becoming dominated by four-strokes, and while this sled is available with the Polaris Turbo 4-banger, we think a naturally aspirated 120 to 130 horsepower four-stroke mill would be welcome here. This is not to say the 600 Cleanfire isn't a great engine. It's fast, runs excellent, and gets acceptable fuel and oil mileage. But these days it seems like low smoke, quiet operation, smoother, more linear power delivery, and the perception that a four-stroke requires less in-season maintenance would make that type of engine more suitable to this class of sled. Now the IQ-LX isn't likely to be mistaken for a hardcore ditch banger or a lake racer, and its 136-inch track doesn't make it a boondocker. But the features and technology Polaris has included on this sled work together to give its rider the long-distance comfort and overall performance they demand.